I am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today. And today we have a special guest from Texas. We've got Tiffany Dowell Lashmet on the line. Welcome back to the podcast, Tiffany.
Hey, Cari, thanks for having me back.
So today we're talking about all things fence law, a good old agriculture law topic. Tiffany, why don't we start off by telling our listeners a little bit more about you? I understand that you work for Texas A&M Extension. Is that right?
I do, yeah. I'm an extension agricultural law specialist here at Texas A&M, which means I basically get to travel the entire state of Texas, talking to ag producers and rural landowners and educating them on legal issues that affect them. I do that, like I say, traveling and doing in-person presentations. I've got a blog, I've got a podcast, and so just trying to reach people and let them make sure that they understand their rights and their legal issues that may come into play. Fence law being one of those issues I get the most questions on.
You do all the things. So I'm curious, Tiffany, out of all your different platforms that you communicate to agriculture producers there in Texas, your blog, your podcast, in-person presentations, I know that you also write articles for livestock publications. Is there one medium that you feel has been the best to communicate with producers, or is it one of those things where you use different platforms to hit different demographics?
Yeah, I think that probably they all build on each other, right? And I think that that's where you could really reach the most people, is if you're willing to sort of differentiate and look for different things, right? Like, I think to myself a lot of times, the guys that are sitting in the plaid shirts and the boots at the extension meetings, like my dad, probably aren't going to listen to me on a podcast. Mm-hmm. But kids like me, maybe, who grew up on the farm and want to go back one day, but right now are working in town and they're listening while they're running on the treadmill, they're probably not going to go to an extension meeting. And so I think that if you get a good balance of all of those ways to reach people, that's really ideal.
So, Tiffany, I'm curious, I know that you're from New Mexico, but as I was thinking about today's conversation, I don't think I know the full story on what led you to want to go to law school in the first place and become an agricultural lawyer. So can you tell us a little bit more about that story?
Yeah, it's crazy, Cari. We go way back, but I guess not that far. But so I grew up, like you said, my family's farm and ranch in eastern New Mexico. We raised cattle and sheep and had farming as well. Very involved in 4-H and FFA. Went to junior college on a livestock judging scholarship and then ended up graduating from Oklahoma State with an ag business degree. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with that. Someone had mentioned my grades were pretty good. Maybe I should look at law school. And so I joined a group there on campus that was like a pre-law club. They brought in different speakers to come and talk. And I thought, wow, that sounds really interesting. And kind of the rest is history. And so took the LSAT. Applied to several different law schools, ended up going back home to the University of New Mexico to get my law degree. Always was interested in ag law, right? Given my background, both growing up and my degree. It was funny that I didn't take a single ag law class in college. They didn't have one at New Mexico. So, you follow what you're interested in, and I guess it works out. And so once I graduated there, I practiced for about 4 years in Albuquerque, and then this job at Texas A&M came open. And it's like my dream job. I mean, I couldn't have designed something better for all of my interests to fit together than what I get to do now.
So I know that today's podcast is going to be focusing more in the area of fence law, but as you travel around the state of Texas, what would you say are the biggest legal issues that are impacting Texas agriculture producers? Like, what do you receive the most questions about?
Good question, Cari. One of the biggest issues is fence law, truthfully. I get questions all the time. I had one this morning. As we see more and more people in Texas, more and more people moving out, out of town to sort of like the ranchette, 10-acre place with, some room for a horse or for some cows or whatever. lots of questions come up about fence law, so that's a big one. I get a lot of questions on eminent domain. Here in Texas, it seems like there's a ton of pipeline projects going on, highway projects, those sorts of things, building out infrastructure. And so lots of questions from landowners on their rights there. I get also a good amount of questions on landowner liability issues. So where if somebody gets injured on their property, or if they're concerned somebody could get injured on their property, what are the laws that apply there and what can they do to protect themselves?
So to begin on fence law, Tiffany, I know that I lived a long part of my life in New York City, but there was an era there that I jumped on the other side of the Mississippi. I was living in Cheyenne, Wyoming for about a year, practicing law out there with a small law firm. And Wyoming is what is called a fence out state. Right? No, wait. Yes, fence out. Yeah. So there's two different kinds of states. There's fence in states and fence out states. Is that really how it breaks down, Tiffany? And can you give us a general overview of those two categories?
Sure. The two categories are how it breaks down. It's more complicated than that within a lot of states. So we can talk about that as well. Mm-hmm. First thing I always tell people, if you have a fence law question, the first thing you've got to figure out is, are you fence in or fence out? Mm-hmm. And say that is closed range or open range. So mm-hmm. if you are a fence out state like Wyoming, okay, that means open range, which means the livestock owner does not have a legal duty to fence their animals in. It's the duty of the neighbor to fence them out. Okay, so if I don't want your goats on my property, I have to fence your goats out. Okay, so that would be a fence out area. Other states are the flip, okay, and that is going to be fence in, or what we call closed range. And there, it's the obligation of the livestock owner to fence their animals in, right? So our same example, we're neighbors. You've got to build the fence to keep your goats in your property and off of mine. So as you can imagine, when you've got two different legal approaches, you got to figure out which one applies, because oftentimes the answer from a legal perspective is different. Historically, it was that states in the West were open range, or what we call fence out. However, I will say that in a lot of states now that's changed in at least certain portions of the state. Texas, I'll give you an example, technically a fence out state, we're open range, unless that has been changed by statute or local election. And truthfully, if you look at the statutes and the local stock laws, most of Texas is now going to be fence in. So you got to really check in your state and drill down and make sure that there are not statutes or local ordinances that change that sort of overarching approach.
Okay. And so if a rancher is a little confused on whether or not they're in a fence in or a fence out state, what would be your suggestion to our listeners who are just at the very basic level? Like what kind of state do I live in?
Sure. The first thing that I would probably tell them to do is contact your local extension agent. Hopefully they know the answer, or they know a specialist, someone like me, that could help you figure out the answer. So the other great thing about that is it's free. So I like that option. The National Ag Law Center also has a reading room where you can click on your state and find fence law statutes that apply. It's not as easy as them saying you're open range or closed range, but it will give you the statutes that apply. You may be able to kind of dig through that. The last option would certainly be if you needed to contact an attorney to find that out. That may be another option as well. Also check with your insurance company. A lot of times the insurance companies are really good about knowing, because they're the ones that would have to defend if there was a claim. If cattle did get out and get hit on a road, for example, they likely have dealt with it and can help you track that down as well.
So how does the difference between fence in, fence out really change things when it comes to liability from your livestock, right? Livestock get out, something happens, there's a car accident. How does that change from standpoint of liability?
Yeah, that I think is where you see one of the two places you see the biggest difference between the two. So if we're in a place and there are cattle that get out on a road and get hit, if it's an open range area, right, a fence out means the landowner had no legal duty to keep his animals in, then the landowner is generally not liable, even if they get hit on the road, right? Because there's no duty. And so if you think back to like tort law in law school, you got to have a duty before you can be liable for something under a negligence theory. And so in an open range area, you're generally not liable, even if they get hit on the road, even if you had no fence, right? Because you technically don't have a duty to even have a fence in an open.
Is that why, Tiffany, when you go out west, and like I've been to Montana, and you'll see cattle guards, when you get on the highway and the interstate there?
Yes, that's exactly it. And there are still some places, even here in Texas, where you can be driving down literally like a, farm to market paved road, and bam, here we are. There's cattle like meandering around because they just don't have an obligation to fence them in. Now, I will say, right, from a livestock owner perspective, regardless of what the law is on that in my county, my cows are fenced in because I don't want them hit by the car. So I don't want think like, oh, well, the livestock owners just don't want to build fences, and so they just let them roam. That's generally not true. Although, like I say, in some areas that are open range, there's not that obligation. Now, the flip, right, if we're in a closed range area or a fence in area and a cow gets out and gets hit on the road, that's where potentially someone can be liable. And I think it depends probably on the specific laws of the different states. I know in Texas, what you would look at is whether or not the landowner either permitted or knowingly permitted that animal to run at large. And it becomes pretty factual. So things like, did you have good fences? Were they in good repair? How often were the livestock out? Did you leave the gate open? Those sorts of things all come into play to determine whether someone's liable or not. It's not automatic liability, but there's the potential for that liability.
Got it. So the states that are fenced in, Tiffany, as a general rule, and of course I understand that every state's going to be a little bit different, are there specifications on the fence needs to be X high, or you need to use an electric fence, or anything like that? I mean, are states getting into the nitty gritty?
I think, again, it probably does depend on the state, and I haven't looked at those for every state. I'll tell you in Texas, the answer as far as what kind of fence you have to be deemed like a sufficient fence for, fence in purposes, there's not statutes on that. There's no requirement where you can go like look up, here's exactly what you have to do to make your fence work. I get a lot of questions on electric fences, especially up here in the Panhandle. We run a lot of cattle on wheat pasture different times of the year. There's been one case in Texas where an electric fence was held to be sufficient, but there's no statute on that or anything. So at least here, it's very fact specific. I get a lot of emails from lawyers looking for people that can serve as expert witnesses on whether a fence was good enough issues, because there's not a statute to like just go plug in.
So in farm leases, grazing leases, etc., who usually has the duty to maintain a fence?
Again, with the disclaimer, right? Everybody's going to bang their head against the table. We know it's probably different in your state, so make sure you check. In Texas, there's not a baseline rule on that, and that's an issue that comes up a lot. And the reason is, if you've priced building a fence lately, holy crap, right? There's a reason people are fighting over who has to pay for that. For example, here in Texas, if you want to build a mile of a barbed wire fence, you're usually looking around $10,000, $11,000. So there's no, at least in Texas, again, there's no baseline rule that says it's automatically the landowner or it's automatically the tenant that builds them. A lot of times, from just a practical standpoint, what you'll see people do is split the cost. A lot of times you'll see a landowner be willing to pay for the materials if the tenant pays for or provides the labor. You see that a lot. Sometimes there's an argument from a tenant that it should be on the landowner because, frankly, when the tenant leaves, the fence stays. And I've seen some people use the idea of helping chip in on a fence as a way to get a landowner to sign a longer term lease, right? Like essentially, if I'm going to help you build this fence and spend that money, I'm going to need a 5-year lease, not a 1-year lease, for example. So there's different ways to use that to your advantage in those negotiations.
So what are like your top tips that you would give to landowners, whether or not they're in a fence out or a fence out state, for liability protection?
Yeah, for liability protection, hands down, the most important thing is you've got to have liability insurance. And that liability insurance has to cover animals out on the roadway. And that seems a little bit silly, but I'm telling you, there are policies that you can have that cover your land that don't cover animals out on the highway. When we first moved to the place that we live now, where our house is, there's about 10 acres. And I called our insurance company. We had a farm and ranch policy. I think it was farm and ranch. Anyway, I called them and I said, is livestock covered? And I had to ask that before we brought our cows because, you know, I'm paranoid. And they said, no, it's not covered. And I asked what it would cost to add it. And it was $8 a year. I mean, can you imagine if we'd had an accident, right? Somebody gets hit. I'm paying probably hundreds of thousands of dollars to an attorney to get me out of that case because I wasn't willing to spend $8. So you need liability insurance. You need to make sure that animals on the roadway are a covered claim. That's the best thing that you can do to protect yourself.
But Tiffany, I'm going to be honest with you. Even for myself, I'm an attorney and a farmer. I have animals. You know, I had some goats that, you know, ate some landscaping and died. And I called my insurance agent and I'm like, is accidental poisoning covered? And I mean, I think it's really hard as an agriculture producer, whether or not you're large or small, to think through all the potential things that could happen. So, I mean, how do you do that? How do you look at your insurance and think about everything that could possibly go wrong? Am I covered?
No, good question. And one distinction that I'll make there, the kind of insurance I'm saying, number one, most important you want to have is liability insurance.
Mm-hmm.
If someone else gets injured because of your actions. So if your cows get out, somebody gets hit and killed, liability insurance comes into play there. If cow eats a weed and dies, liability insurance isn't helping us. You would have separate, right, like coverage for the livestock. You need to have like livestock mortality insurance. And I don't know if you've ever priced that, Cari, but woo, it's cheap.
Yeah, so, I don't have any race horses or show cattle here.
That's right. So from our perspective, we've priced it. We don't carry it. We don't do mortality insurance just because of a cost benefit thing. We've looked at the numbers. So you need to think about the type of coverage that you're looking at. I would never skimp on the liability coverage just because of the likelihood of you being sued if something you do, something your animals do, ends up getting someone injured or killed. Just the potential risk exposure is huge. The other thing to keep in mind about liability insurance is if you have it and there's a covered claim, the insurance company pays for your lawyer, right? They provide you a defense, they pay for the lawyer, you're not at that money out of pocket, which is a huge deal if you end up having to go to trial or something. So I certainly think talk to your insurance company, really walk them through what you're doing on your operation to figure out the right insurance for you. But everybody needs liability insurance.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, Tiffany, because, you know, in sort of an unrelated matter, but, you know, somebody that I know was basically getting sued. And my first point of advice was call your insurance company. This is what you pay for. They have the duty to defend you, right? In these types of lawsuits. So I think a lot
of I'm telling you, like, that's easy for us to say because, like, right, we learned that in law school, but people, like, quote unquote, real normal people don't oftentimes know that, right? They don't realize that part of that coverage is a defense from the insurance company. And that's huge. I mean, like I said, you essentially have an insurance, you essentially have a on retainer paid for by somebody else. Like, that's a big deal.
Right. Absolutely. So Tiffany, as generally speaking, when our listeners are looking for an agriculture attorney, somebody that can help them navigate these fence law issues or other agriculture issues, what's your advice for making sure that our listeners get in the right hands for them?
Yeah, you know, finding an attorney is something that I know can be frustrating and difficult because a lot of times there's not just a like, oh, here's where you Google and here's all the good people that pop up, right? That would be helpful, but it doesn't work that way. So what I always tell people is, you know, ask around. I think word of mouth, especially in the ag industry, is a great way to find someone. You know, if somebody contacts me even from another state, I'm sure you're the same. We've got contacts all over the country, especially due to some of the groups that we're a part of, like the American Ag Law Association. So I would ask any lawyers that you know, even if they're in other states, if they can recommend people. I'd talk to your neighbors or other people that are involved in ag in your state, see if they've had to use someone and can recommend them. If you do get with an attorney to talk to them, I always tell people you're interviewing the attorney as they're interviewing you. And so you need to ask them questions and make sure that they understand what's going on, right? If you walk up to an attorney and they don't understand anything about the ag, activity that you're involved in, man, you're going to have to start and do a lot of backgrounding for them, and that may not be ideal. So I try to talk to them about, the type of ag operation or business that you have. I would ask them how many cases they've handled on this topic, right? So if I was going to hire somebody to do a fence law case, I don't want to be their first case. So I'd ask that question as well. So that's sort of some tips that I would offer.
It's funny because when I first started practicing law and I just hung my shingle, I was very uncomfortable with that question whenever people would be like, how many cases like this have you handled? But, now here I am, 12 years later, and, I don't shy away from that question. In fact, all that does is show me the maturity of the person who, making sure that they're in the right hands. And so I welcome that question now. I think that that's totally a fair question to ask attorneys. So.
Right. Well, the other thing, I've heard attorneys answer that question with things like, listen, I do a lot of litigation. I haven't done a specific thing, but here's what I know about this topic. 1, 2, 3. Here's who I know that I can call in to help me. There's other ways to answer that. Maybe it is going to be your first case, but if you've got the background, the knowledge, the contacts to do it, that's where I think an attorney can really sell themselves and still end up with a client, even on a first case type issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that some clients might not feel comfortable with that, but as an attorney, you're basically taught to think and problem solve. And I think a lot of people just assume that attorneys are like a living encyclopedia. You just call us up and we're going to give you the answer, but it doesn't work that way, right?
Right. That's
so right. I think that understanding that there's like a team, you have a teammate here, and you're both going to try to solve the problems together with hopefully a dose of preventative medicine. I think that that's the right way to go about it.
That's a great way to put it.
Tiffany, I want to close because I know we're in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'm wondering, Tiffany, how is home office life treating you? And do you have any tips for survival for our listeners that are also maybe bored in the house or stuck in quarantine right now?
Yeah, it's a good question, Cari. So I have 2 little kids. I've got a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old. We have been quarantined at home together for going on about 40 days, and it is sheer chaos. I'll give you a couple of pieces of advice that have worked for me. One thing that I've been doing that I've really enjoyed is making a list of things I'm grateful for at the end of the day. And there are times where it's easy to forget that we are super blessed, we're super fortunate. And so making a list of even little things, right? Like we saw the sunset, or my kid taught me some new fact about a dinosaur or whatever. That's been great. And so that's been sort of helped me stay grounded and focus on what matters. From the kids' standpoint, one of my parenting philosophies is when things get bad, you need to add water. And so my kids have spent a lot of time playing in the bathtub and the swimming pool and the stock tank because we're just trying to survive, So that's my advice. Have a gratitude list, and if those kids get to where they're driving you crazy, just add water.
Love it. Well, thank you, Tiffany, for coming back. Appreciate it. And then on a final note, how can people contact you if they're wanting to reach out and ask you some fence law questions?
Sure. Yeah. So you can contact me. Probably the best place to go is my blog. You can just Google Texas Agriculture Law blog. There you can find my email address, my phone number. If you're interested in ag law, I post different articles every week. The other place that I do some work is on a podcast. It's called Ag Law in the Field. You can find that anywhere you listen to podcasts, your podcast app, iTunes, all the places.
Excellent. Thanks, Tiffany.
Thanks, Cari.